discussion today with two really great minds. They're also the founders of two very public and global platforms that are together trying to, influence the impact investing industry and have continuously questioned our motives, our work, and have been pioneers in the impact investing space. So without further ado, I would like to begin by giving you all a very, very short introduction of what today's panel is going to focus on, and then request both Kevin and Vineet to give us their opening remarks. The impact investing industry is a relatively new space. However, it is growing very rapidly, and with rapid growth comes, great challenges. And some of these challenges include the intent of investing, especially when we're trying to create impact, we're trying to reduce vulnerabilities, and we're dealing with very systemic issues. And over the years, the term impact and impact investing has been romanticized by many and critiqued by an equal number. In today's webinar, we're going to take a look at this industry's evolution and answer some of the questions that are staring us in the face on what next and how do we move from here. But before we go into that, I did want to put some context to the impact investing industry. According to a recent Ginn and Cambridge Associate report, impact investment funds tend to be very small. 27 of the 51 funds that were analyzed were less than $50 million in size. While in the larger universe of investing, over 71% of the funds have more than $100 million in their fund size. This, combined with a vintage of not more than 10 years, is the reality of our industry. So are we then expecting too much too soon? Are we growing too big for our own boots? How do we address some of these mounting concerns and present a real picture for impact investing for now and as we go forward? So with these very, very pertinent and somewhat existential questions, I'm going to request both Vineet and Kevin to come in with their opening remarks and talk about what they think the impact investing industry's performance has been till date. Maybe we can start with Kevin.
Thank you, Kanika. Is the sound working? Can you hear me?
Yes, Kevin.
Okay, I am assuming that's yes. Okay, great. So I want to, since these are existential questions, I want to ask a further question. Is this an industry, and is defining it as an industry something that is helpful or hurting? I think at its heart, this is a movement fueled by moral hunger that uses the market, and the more we let the market and the traditional system frame what we were doing, the more we were replicating the game of empire and colonialism. You know, at its worst, I think impact investing is just a carryover of Victorian imperial philanthropy, trying to fund the deserving poor. At its best, it's something like, say, Keisha Cash, an African-American venture capitalist in the U.S., who is investing in things like salons for African-American hairstylists and letting them own the product, that the hair extensions, rather than buy those from other folks, and so they can make as much as $300 more a month when they're only making $24,000. But that's a thing where she understood the market, she understood the people, and it's not a white do-gooder trying to come in and help people, but it's someone who actually understands the needs of the market. And she got not an impact investor, but she got Andreessen Horowitz, who sees that this is a huge market and poor folks pay too much or they don't make enough wealth, and so that's a huge market. So I think at its best, it is led by the people who know the people they're trying to help.
Thanks, Kevin. Vineet, do you want to add your comments?
Yeah, look, Kevin has this great ability to actually bring in abstractism to something very precise, so let me actually keep things very simple. To me, impact investing was really a conflicted thought process from the time it started. I was there in 2008 when the name was coined, and it was very clear right at that point of time that we will continue to have a tug of war between the impact folks and the investing folks. I think in 2008, when people actually coined the term, there was a very great belief amongst most of them that impact is guaranteed. The question is only whether we can generate returns. I think 10 years down the line, what is clear is that you can make money, but can you really make impact? And that uncertainty has completely reversed. So we are at 180 degrees of where we were 10 years back. What is impact investing? I think that really, if one goes by GIN and try to, well, there are questions about who accepts GIN definition and who doesn't, but assuming for a minute that they have put in a definition, there are two important questions that come out. One is actually the intent, probably one of the best ways to guise something, because nobody knows what my intent is, and there is, if until unless you codify the intent and explicitly come out with it, there is no way one can actually understand how your intent is changing over a period of time. So really saying that an intent of the investor defines his impact credentials is something which I believe is very questionable until unless it is codified. The other part of it is reporting of impact. That's roughly $20,000 in any part of the global economy. Roughly hire an analyst and ask him to count every human being that your business model develops. So my question has always been existential from the perspective of definition, intent, which is very superfluous and can be moved in any direction you want to, and impact, which is $20,000, because finally it's counting number of people and putting them in different boxes and structures. If that's what impact investing is, I surely am not an impact investor, and I would not like to be part of this movement. As Kevin actually mentioned, that impact investing is really about a moral hunger, a desire for some people to actually go that extra mile to make a difference. I think that's really what I believe impact investing is. While we can try to codify it, we can try to report impact, but if you don't bring in the desire to make the difference and therefore emphasize or demonstrate it by questioning yourself, it's a marathon that you're running against yourself and not against a crowd. And I think these are some of the opening remarks that I have, good enough to provoke a lot of people. I'm not a naysayers, I'm actually an optimist, but I do genuinely believe that we are not here to actually count human beings as numbers and report them in different beautiful graphics as impact.
Thank you, Vineet and Kevin. After those very, very powerful opening statements, what I'd like to dig deeper is, Kevin, you had made a statement about, making sure that the venture is not non-extractive, that we don't take out more than we put in. Is that one way of maybe measuring impact and being true to the intent of creating impact? Do you think those kind of transformative finance principles are what is required, and do you see that in practice today?
It's interesting because I am managing a traditional in the time signature of it, impact fund, Good Capital's first social enterprise impact expansion fund, and we have a time basis, and we're measured on internal rate of return, which is how fast you make the money and how fast you bring it back. That is the venture capital metric. That is also a pirate's metric. And I think the metric of venture capital doesn't work with impact. So I think we're lucky in our fund that we will be exiting our companies and they won't have to sell, and they are still going to be able to do good as we exit. Both of them are able to doing well enough to help us exit. But I think venture capital's metric does not equate with impact. The traditional time signature of internal rate of return is not synonymous and is not consonant with, it doesn't fit with actually making a difference. And so I think you can use risk capital for good, but you have to use a different way of measuring the time of return and dethroning the traditional venture capital metric of internal rate of return, which is just purely time-based. All it means is how fast did you get the money back, and how much money did you get. That's all it measures. So, to what extent are the new funds, just using internal rate of return as a metric? If you're using that as a metric, you really can't do impact right. So that's. But if you use the transformative finance folks who use non-extractive impact, and they have three other parts of it, including the community in on the entrance including the community on the design and including the community on the exit, I think is those are really key metrics, and I think those are things that we need to think about.
Great. So Vineet, moving to you, you manage quite a few funds, and you certainly have quite an opinion about the way we measure impact. As Avishkar, how do you see your impact being created through your enterprises? Do you use the principles that Kevin was referring to, or you have often also referred to taking risk as also being one form of measuring impact and impact investing? So how would you compare what's happening to what should happen?
I think some of the challenges of doing what we do is there is actually a lot of blurring of lines, and a lot of things that we say can be construed wrongly as well. But let me start by saying that one of the basic premise of actually being different as an impact investor would mean that you would actually participate in value creation rather than participate in value participation. That means if you are not doing something very different and unique from what other investors are already doing, then why should you be called an impact investor? That's actually one question. And that's where I bring it out. One of the themes people have been trying to bring out is saying that we are actually reporting impact. And I say that in a $100 million fund, $20,000 is what you will spend on reporting impact. Maybe $30,000. Is that really sufficient to be different? I think the question of risk, question of actually doing something which is additional and different, stems from the fact that it is not good enough to actually take money from somebody and give it to somebody and say that the impact is always made by the enterprise. The question of impact actually lies squarely on the shoulder of the fund itself. And therefore, I, as a fund manager, is equally responsible for making the impact, as is the entrepreneur who actually takes the product, makes the product or the service, or creates the job or the livelihoods, or reduces vulnerability for the people. So how do you actually bring back the accountability of making a difference on the shoulders of the fund manager, who are very willingly and in a very rapid manner trying to transfer it to the entrepreneur? Knowing well that starting a business and running a business is very challenging, and some of those metrics could actually be how much risk is the investor taking, how much additional thing that he is doing, how far in the geography is he going, what kind of business models is he bringing to the table, is there something new, is there a first time effect, is there a pioneering role is he playing, or is it just participating and doing the same thing that many other mainstream investors are doing? And I think that's really the crux of it. The crux is not really just about risk. The crux is actually, do you have the willingness and desire to stand up and define and codify what your intent is? And once you have done that, probably after that you report that impact in line with what your intent was, makes an impact investor, and not just creating outputs using analysts.
Right. So, so would we be right in assuming that impact measurement, or assuming higher risk, or assuming more patience in capital is one of the biggest challenges that the impact investing industry is currently struggling with, and maybe that's something we need to delve more into as we move towards impact investing 2.0? Vineet or Kevin, either of you.
I'll take this for a minute, actually. I think
Sure.
the first step that we are actually dealing with right now is exhorting the impact investor to stand up and say, why is he an impact investor? I think to me that's step number one, and that's actually impact investing 1.0. If you want to move to impact investing 2.0, you have to actually then talk about capital efficiencies. And when you talk about capital efficiencies, you have to reverse the efficiency and actually say, did your capital actually create something that created a difference? Because if creating jobs is actually an indicator, or going into rural India is an indicator, buying stocks of Unilever is a much better impact investment than actually trying to create an enterprise. I think the challenges and metrics have to be redefined and rediscussed if we have to attract more capital. Remember that it is not the impact investor who has the control over patience and risk. It is the impact investor's limited partners from where he raises the capital, where the challenge lies. And that's where I think the role of institutions like Global Impact Investor Network or India Impact Investor Council is to bring together the people who are taking the capital like us And those whose capital it is, the pension funds, the development finance institutions, the family foundations, who actually want to participate in our funds, to make them have a dialogue that brings this question on, are we really patient? Do we really want to be patient? Is there actually a time value for money that is uncompromising? And if so, how do you actually take risk and create a new kind of impact to bring the money back? And really, to me, that actually is the 2.0. Unfortunately, we are still struggling to define the 1.0.
Kevin, would you have remarks to this?
Yeah, and I think the gears metrics, as laudable as they are, were basically an attempt to validate the market to Wall Street. And that was to show that it's big, it's real, it's growing. And when we did the SOCAP conference, Social Capital Markets, Market at the Intersection of Money and Meaning, it's the largest conference in the world. It's the same thing. We want to validate the market. But they aren't of any real value to any company. I mean, if you look at one of my companies, in my portfolio company, Alter Eco, it's doing fabulously well. It's about, it's grown 12x in revenue since we invested 4 years ago. And it's quinoa chocolate, organic, fair trade. But the things they've done beyond that are huge. And they've made the packages compostable, so you can throw away the truffles and your waistline grows, but your footprint goes down. And they've beyond biodiversity, they've been carbon negative for 2 or 3 years. This last year, they're carbon negative by incest. So that means that the groundwater and biodiversity around commercial farming is actually higher because of commercial farming. Look, no metric measures the real value that they create. And I think if you look at the best companies, very few to any metric, it is unique and individual and complex, whereas gears is a broad, linear thing to show the size of the market. So I don't think we have metrics that are geared for complexity. They were okay to go in, which is also kind of why hype has a reason to get us on the block, and now we don't need the hype anymore. So I think we need more complex, subtle, multidimensional metrics. And there are some coming out of like the Oxford Poverty and Human Indicators out of Oxford and some other places. There are more complex metrics of what impact really is. I think the work that Sabina Alkir is doing around that is being adopted by aid agencies. But that means you have to get rid of the idea that size matters and that more money matters. You have to actually measure stuff with such social complexity. That's why the Keisha Cash example, Andreessen Horowitz was not encumbered by a theory of change, so they were able, where impact investors weren't, to invest in an African American VC going after the hair salon market because it's going in someplace new, and the folks from Stanford and MIT don't know how to look at that problem, so they didn't do it, whereas the really brilliant venture capitalists like Andreessen Horowitz did. So I think sometimes the traditional investors can find the better deals because we're hampered by the way we think. And it's time to get rid of better metrics that are more complex, deal with complexity, deal with context, deal with cultural literacy. And I'd like to see some of that stuff happen.
Great. So this is sort of bringing out two points are hitting me. One is there too much hype around impact investing? Are we expecting too much impact too soon? And are we really targeting the right kind of impact? Is impact investing designed to solve larger systemic problems, or do we need to be real and realize its limitations? So do you think there is too much hype associated with impact investing and too many expectations that come along with that hype, and how do we break that and make it more real for people who are not close enough to impact investing but have very high expectations of it? Vineet, do you want to go?
Yeah. I think the challenge with hype, so first and foremost, everybody loves hype. I would be the last guy to say that we don't want hype. Hype is actually a good thing. Specifically when you are actually very small and inconsequential in the game, if you don't shout aloud, nobody will not be heard. So hype is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with it. And the more hyped impact investing is good for us. The point is not really about hype. The point is actually what message and what expectations you are setting when you are being hyped up. Microfinance suffered very badly by actually saying that we are not really a business of bringing a certain kind of certain kind of people into the banking mainstream, but by saying we will remove poverty. The truth is microfinance cannot remove poverty. It's far too complex for microfinance to do it. I think the challenge that impact investing is facing is the potential that it holds is actually being misconstrued and missold. Impact investing is basically a simple act of some people with money taking a calculated risk in making investments, in discovering markets, in actually coming up with businesses that are investing in businesses that are working with a person or a client or a customer with a very small wallet, which essentially means the chance of you making money is difficult, not impossible. And this actually does not make a rich person a poor person rich or a rich person poor. The expectation that we will, in impact investing, solve the world's problem is a misplaced expectation. It's romanticized and is a very wrong way to do it. Yes, you will be able to bring a significant amount of population that is marginalized into an economic activity or participate in something which may benefit, can create value, and surely create significant benefits for the sum. But there is always a flip side to every commercial activity, because finally it's a trade-off. The product that we make may not necessarily reduce vulnerability. The livelihoods that we may create can bring in some other bad messages associated with it. Something that we are trying to do which should not pollute may pollute. We really do not know what kind of impacts we are going to make. What we surely can say, and this is exactly where the GIN definition has its value, that these are the set of people who have the right intent, and they are actually trying to take every precaution to make the right kind of impact. That's really, we are actually not making impact, we are claiming that we are making an impact. There is absolutely no way to find out whether you are making an impact. The simplistic answer is, have you created jobs? The answer is yes, but then any business creates jobs. So does this mean every business is a social enterprise? Is real estate, which actually every five-star hotel you make, is that a social enterprise? And I think those are very existential and very simple questions. Really the challenge lies in trying to make these, finding answers to these questions. And the real challenge therefore is not really about whether hype is needed or not, whether the hype is actually about creating expectations that we are never going to meet. And I think that's where the fear starts about the hype.
Great. Kevin, what are your thoughts on hype and the actual impact that impact investing can create?
Yeah, I agree with Vineet that hype is needed. And I also agree with him that the risk of that is that it does create unrealistic expectations. I mean, the market solves some problems. It doesn't solve all problems. In the U.S., I think there are occasionally places where the market and justice overlaps. And the space of financial inclusion is one right now, making money, reducing the cost of being poor. Poor people in America, probably other places, but I know the U.S. market, are incredibly victimized. It costs so much to be poor because they pay all kinds of other transaction fees that I don't pay, that other people don't pay. And so things that are working on financial inclusion really can be market rate because there's such an entrenched systemic injustice around what they pay that you can make a good business and still reduce the cost of being poor, and your impact there is relatively easily measured. Did you reduce the cost of being poor? But it doesn't solve all kinds of things. I mean, I noticed today there is a vaccine almost ready in malaria, and I worked 2 years in malaria, and there is no real market opportunity around malaria. The people there are just too poor. There is no money to be made if you have to give in order to make that happen. The Gates Foundation, several years ago when I was, more than a decade ago when I was working on it, 15 years ago, realized that 3/4 of the people who needed the vaccine would actually need to be subsidized. So that's why research there has been so slow. So there are places where the market solves a problem and an entrepreneur solves a problem, but so many places it doesn't do that. And so I think it can be a force for helping solve the problems of the world, but it doesn't solve all those problems. The market is a limited tool, but it's been a tool where investing was just for financial return, and now it is also for doing some good. That's a major shift, and I think maybe the biggest thing that's happening is that it's causing people to think differently about themselves and their money. There really is, we've used the word existential, but there really is an existential shift when you become an impact investor. You have decided something different about what is yours and what is ours, and your relationship to the world and stuff, and how much is for you and how much is for everybody has changed. And there's too little about that, because I think we've been worried about becoming credible as an industry, when I don't think we are an industry. I think we are still a movement that just uses the market as a tool.
Great. Actually, that leads me very well into my next question. And I'm pulling out questions from what some of our participants have already put in. So a lot of the questions were around should impact investing, and if we're still saying we're not an industry as yet and we're yet to become as big, should we become that big? Should we go mainstream? And if we do, how do we go mainstream? How do we involve retail investors? How do we involve the larger financial institutions and sensitize them to some of the challenges that we're already facing? Vineet, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think it's actually an interesting question. First and foremost, let's actually try to understand what do they mean by mainstream. If the mainstream is actually there, first there is already a mainstream, so we don't need to actually have impact investing to go mainstream. But what I really understand from the question is that can you actually raise capital that is from the mainstream people instead of exceptional people, so that you can increase the kitty of impact investing? My guess is that's really the question, and not necessarily that should we start investing into real market stocks or in Wall Street. The answer is yes and no. Are we big enough? Should we become big enough? Well, I think the reason we all exist is because we want to actually push a large amount of capital to go towards this side. But the problem is, if we do not know which side we are pushing the capital to, when we are actually still debating, are we actually aware of what our claims about impact, are they right? Do we actually really believe what our expectations are from what we are doing? Is this actually about patience? Is this about actually taking risk? Or is it actually about just returning capital in a faster manner, which venture capital is already doing? I think the real question before we actually start attracting capital, and I think you will never stop attracting capital from everybody and anybody. We will go to pension funds, we will go to crowdsourcing, we will go to retail markets, we will go to anybody and everybody seeking money. The problem is the money will not come to you until unless you have answered these questions categorically and very clearly, articulating them and defining yourself where you can replicatively continue to pour this money to create the benefits that you are claiming you are creating. Money that is coming from mainstream sources is very risk averse, does not like to follow those people who are unclear about what they are doing. And hence, the need for clarity is important before you can actually have the world open doors and pour their money into your bucket so that you can sow the seeds of impact investing and scale them to make banyan trees.
Okay. Kevin, can you also respond to this? But just before that, to all our participants, there's a poll out there. You can answer, and this is going to the previous question around hype or substance in impact investing. And once you answer, we will collect your responses and share it. So, Kevin, going to you about mainstreaming impact investing and when should we and how do we engage the larger financial market?
Right. Well, mainstreaming, I think in some sense, some people want it, as Vineet said, maybe it's about accessing capital, or maybe it's about domesticating something that could be structurally and systemically disruptive and taming it and co-opting it. There are a lot of things around mainstreaming that are troubling questions. The powers that be, the imperial colonial forces that still run the U.S., that still run the IMF, is oppressing Greece with a bailout that we all know won't work. Those forces are not benevolent, and so there is much about capitalism that has been shown by Piketty's research to be inherently extractive on a systemic basis. We're taking more out of the earth than we can. So I don't know that I want to sign on to being mainstream if mainstream means the Washington global neoliberal consensus where a firm like Goldman Sachs buys one of the largest advisory firms, and so what happens? Because we know Goldman Sachs is not a firm that is about good. Goldman Sachs will bet against its clients and will bet for its clients and play both sides. what happens when something like Goldman Sachs tries to come in and if they're buying something with a major presence? What's the risk of going mainstream? And it goes back to Vineet's question: what difference do we want to make? I think this is, it is fueled by a moral hunger. It uses the market, and the more that we adopt the terms of the market and come into compliance, the more that we'll be co-opted, and it's just a chumps game.
Right. Actually, that moves me to, if ever we go mainstream, or even with the pace at which our own industry is going, some of these challenges require regulation, require monitoring, and of course, monitoring and regulation have to come at various levels, given the global as well as local nature of impact investing. And how do you see that we can manage some of these potential risks for impact investing as a whole, and avoid some of the crises we saw with microfinance in India, or some of the other potential crises that could be staring us in the face. Vineet, I know you have quite a few thoughts on this, so you can.
I think let's actually be very clear. When you are dealing with rich, you are always safe. When you are dealing with poor, you are always vulnerable. They are vulnerable. You are trying to actually do business with them. You have to take it for granted. The chances are that if things go wrong, you would be on the wrong side of the divide. So I think as impact investors, we have to first humbly accept that if we go wrong, we should be held accountable. And if things will go wrong, the government will haul you. Now the question is actually, are we willing to actually wait till things go wrong? Or are we willing to self-regulate ourselves so that we can actually mitigate the risk of vulnerability that we can impose on the people we are going to work with? And I think that's really basically the debate where it needs to be pushed on. And I think the reason I continue to insist about actually going back and having clarity of what we are and who we are before we open the doors of mainstream capital to chase us, before we actually open the door and start participating with very large behemoths like Goldman Sachs and others, I think the challenge really is to define what is it that you are doing and how would you manage the risks if and when you scale up. Dealing with this kind of population with very small wallets, with very high risk vulnerability, where anything and everything that you're doing for their own good can actually become bad for them. Microfinance very beautifully demonstrated to us in India that money in small quantities was good for the person. The same money in small quantities lended to the same person by 10 different people was bad for the person. How do you actually regulate that thought process? When capital will come from mainstream, it would actually be very severely competing against each other. It will take away the desire to actually make a difference to the individual. The individual will become a statistic, and the moment he becomes a statistic, his importance or relevance to the cause of impact investing will go down. And until as you have systems, processes, and risk mitigants in place, you would find it very difficult to really make the difference. And I think that's really the caution that we are trying to throw. And I may sound negative, but actually, as I said, repeated again, I'm a fairly optimistic guy. I genuinely believe impact investing should scale, but I do not believe it is an industry. I hope and pray it doesn't become an industry. To me, it remains a movement within the main financial system. It is actually about taking capital and finding those people who have a conscience to use the capital for the right reason. If you go and look at the best venture capitalists in Silicon Valley or even in India or anywhere in the world, you would find those venture capitalists actually not really targeting an IRR. They actually invest in paradigm shifting innovations, in great teams and entrepreneurs, and then they expect returns to be an outcome. And in case you find very good ideas and invest in very good people, chances are you'll make very high returns, not by chasing returns. Similarly, an impact investor is one who's actually find a great entrepreneur or a team of entrepreneurs, invest in them to support great ideas. Both impact and returns will be an outcome which neither I nor the entrepreneur knows about. And unless we clearly understand this, we will continue to chase something which will remain a mirage for all of us.
Thanks, Vineet. That's very powerful. Kevin, what would your thoughts be on this topic? And monitoring and regulation.
You want to not enable regulation by having good action that doesn't require regulation. I think that's one thing you start from. but I think there's I guess I can tell two simple stories that would illustrate where I think it needs to go. There's a really clever technology being used in Africa that is a huge time saver for women carrying water rather than carrying the water on their heads. It's a rolling thing, and it's large. And so at first glance, it seems like it's extremely valuable. It cuts something that can take 2 hours to 20 minutes or so. But actually, the adoption of that device has been extremely limited because that time walking to the water together is the only time that the women in that patriarchal culture get to be together and get to be unsupervised. And this rolling thing makes it into a solitary trip, so you don't get to be together with yours. And so they're saving the only valuable time of the week. And that was one of the things where it was a well-meaning white entrepreneur who did, what they call user-centric design, but it was embedded in such a culture of privilege that, the poor folks answered to the powerful white person, yes, that seems like it's great in the way that they do, but, they don't mean it. It's just the way they respond to powerful people. That kind of well-meaning Stanford, MIT, Harvard student deploying technology and not realizing that the people are not going to tell you the truth because of who you are and where you're from should be stopped. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting right now, again, in financial inclusion, is a company called eMoneyPool, and there's several like this. And these are lending circles where people put up $100 a week, and in 10 weeks you get $1,000. Those exist in every immigrant culture in the U.S., and they have their own name. The Hmong have one name for them. The Filipinos have another name for them. And it's a technology being put out by two young men who were immigrants from Jalisco, and that's the only way their mother, who was outside the financial system, could save. So they understand it. They know how to go into a community and sell that technology. So I think, in the U.S., I think that people who are of those cultures, who understands the need of those cultures, can find places where the market can solve a problem. Right now, technology in the U.S. is being put to good use. It's a place where market overlaps with justice in financial inclusion. That's a place that reduces the cost of being poor. It's not debt. It enhances savings. So I think that, we have too many well-meaning white folks out of colleges inflicting solutions without understanding that, the people that you go to are going to tell you yes because that's what they've been told to do, and you don't understand the power embedded in your question. I think the more we have entrepreneurs of color or of different cultures talking to the people that they're working with, we'll have impact investing will become a tool by people who are of that community, who are reaching that community.
That's actually, Kevin, I'm going to pose another question to you just following up on this. Given the extremely diverse nature of impact investing, the very large number of global participants, but almost an equal number of local participants, and the need to always contextualize when you're investing in impact or you're running a social business, do you think there's a lot of tension between the local and the global, or do you see them, as part of a larger whole, living more, peacefully with each other?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think everything is local. I think that's really the answer. I think the two young men from Jalisco are spreading eMoneyPool across the country because they understand the cultural context. So I think cultural literacy is a way to work that. They know how to reach those people. Keisha Cash understands the black salon market and understands where you can own a product rather than go send somebody off to a product and suddenly you're adding 30% to your income. So I think it's cultural literacy is the thing to look for. Local and global, as one of the old things says, all politics is local. I think all investing becomes local because everybody is buying within a cultural context or is not buying.
And Vineet, what would your thoughts be on the global and local tension or merger? Do the twains meet?
I actually seriously don't bother about these things. I don't think so. This is so important for this. I mean, there will always be a conflict wherever two different contexts is, and local and global or local and local also conflict. So really, this is actually something that is not going to wish away, and it probably is not important really for the impact investing folks who are still trying to figure out who they are. So we should limit our conversations to our abilities rather than start solving the world's problem. Tomorrow we'll actually you started using impact investing to solve Greece problem, and that's my fear actually. So.
So we have just about another 10 minutes to go. I'll quickly update everyone on the result of the polls. It seems like about 60% of our participants think there is too much hype, or there is or maybe too much hype in impact investing, and about 37% say no. So now quickly moving on to some audience questions. This is a question from Mukund Prasad. He says that G8 governments and private investors are currently hyping up social impact bonds. Thoughts on this new concept where outcomes will be funded, not activities? Kevin or Vineet, any one of you want to go for this question?
Kevin, you want to take it?
Well, I think in the U.S., in the U.S., our first social impact bond lost money and didn't create impact. And I think the results from the first recidivism bond in the UK show that it had similar results. I think it's a paradigm-shifting thing. The idea of a social impact bond is that you go up the cliff and put in barriers rather than try to deal with the symptoms of somebody driving off the cliff. And I think it's an approach. And the fact that it failed is kind of okay. I think it's a good approach. We don't know. We haven't proved that it works, but I think it's conceptually I'm really it really appeals to me. I mean, it also shows treatment does better than incarceration for drug use. There are all those sorts of things. This is trying to apply finance to that kind of thinking, and it makes great intuitive sense. Unfortunately, it hasn't been proved to work yet.
Vineet?
I think impact bonds again are anything that is a new idea is actually welcome, and I think there is a value to it. It's just that it's much more nascent than the whole act of actually using equity as this thing. So really, hyping it is probably not the smartest thing to do, but then the truth is that it exists, and there is actually some value to it. So.
Great. So we have another question from Miranda.
I agree. I think there's real value to it. And
sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I think there is real value to it, and I think it should be at least as valuable as a hidden particle that we don't know in science yet. I mean, there is something there. We haven't gotten there yet.
Great. And just moving on to another question from Miranda. She has a comment that says, how do we increase the risk appetite for the second and third bottom line? Standard VCs only need 2 out of 10 investments to work to be happy, but it is much harder to take that risk for social and environmental returns, given that the downside impacts life. This ultimately makes impact investing more risk averse. And she follows that up with a question saying, how do we change the mindsets of investors to look at metrics and impact differently? Vineet, do you want to take that since you're an investor yourself and you're also part of the Impact Investors Council? How do we help the impact investors to change mindsets?
I think first they have to have a mindset for you to change it. And I think that's really the important question. The real question is not really whether their mindset needs to be changed. One question that you need to ask is, does an impact investor has a mindset? And if so, what is it? I think a lot of impact investors are basically disguising as impact investors. These are masquerading as impact investors and not really impact investors. These are people who are out there to actually have a job. These are people out there who actually just want capital so that they can actually make impact. And I think this is really one of the challenges that you will continue to see. But those who have a point of view or who are actually trying to do something, they have their own challenges. And the challenges actually does not stop to the impact investor himself. It goes to where the capital is coming from. And I think that debate about what the capital is supposed to do and why and how it should be measured is actually an open debate right now. So the question is a very genuine one, but unfortunately the answer is a very long-winded one.
Okay. Kevin, do you know how to change impact investors' mindset?
Yeah, I've got special water. You buy it from me, and you know, I mean, you know, you always get this question of how do I change the minds of the people who are not in the room that I don't know? I mean, I try to avoid that question. I get it a lot. You know, how do we change the mindset of the people who are not in the room who are enlightened like we are? It's like, well, you know, get out of the room, go talk to them, or just shut up. It's a destructive question, and it's the assumptions behind it are just. I try to avoid that question in all the forms in which it comes.
Kevin, there is a question actually addressed to you, or probably something that you said. And since you are actually a white man yourself, probably it's a very apt question for you from Chris Canstrip, if I'm not wrong. It's there on the.
That's right.
I think
I'll read it out, Kevin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the gentleman that said that entrepreneurs should be of more minorities and different cultures, that isn't wrong, but he is forgetting that many people who are white have worked in development in these developing countries and can come up with solutions as well. I know he wasn't only saying that minorities know, but I think it shouldn't be based on race or culture, but experience. Kevin, your thoughts or any responses to that?
Sure, some of my best friends are white folks. You know, I mean, you know, the point is, you know, I think you need to understand the culture in which you're working. Obviously, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm not saying white folks can't create impact. I think I've done okay, at least according to my, you know, compared to my peers on this kind of stuff. But I think we have a lot, you know, you have a lot of embedded cultural assumptions based on where you come from. There are a lot of people with tons of, you know. I can, you know, yeah, white folks can do good. Okay, fine, we're done.
We have time for just two more questions. What role do large corporations have in pushing the impact investment movement forward, and how can impact investing be implemented within CSR? Kevin, do you want to take that?
You know, it's something I really find interesting. I haven't seen a way forward, and I keep looking for a way forward. I think there are some corporations who do it pretty well. You know, Starbucks is really trying to change the way it sources, and I'm familiar with that because of, you know, my pretty extensive fair trade experience. But you know, when you get down, so let's take fair trade as an example, because that's one of the ones that people look at. You know, the problem is there's a premium. You know, it costs more to do fair trade coffee, and so therefore you have to have a value around the people, often brown people, who are growing your beans, and so that gets into the behavior change kind of thing. You know, how do you get those people to care more about the people who are not in the room that they don't seem to care much about? So you know, the places where it impacts seamlessly and easily with the market reality are great. You know, and the places where demand moves in are great. I mean, one of the places we've seen behavior change in the U.S. rapidly is around, you know, LGBT rights, and that's a group whose rights are moving forward really rapidly, and we're moving backward on black civil rights. So it gets into, you know, how can you sell them? Can you get a premium around them? And if you can't get a premium around them, how can you justify it? Those are the questions that I get stumped on when I try to go further with the corporate folks. You can do a lot of CSR demonstration projects, and those are not bad of themselves. That's just what they are. It's CSR window dressing, and that's, you know, it's not insignificant. It's not terrible. It's nothing. It doesn't change anything.
Vineet, do you have any thoughts on how to engage corporations?
Well, I think corporations are very big giants, and I think it's a slow process. So let's actually, I mean, see, in India, CSR has actually been mandated by the government. There are people who are spending 2%, and some of them have actually decided to look at impact investing. But again, if you're a large corporate and you're actually looking at impact investing, since you are reputationally very sensitive, people are extremely risk averse to investing in it. The question is, if somebody like me has been approached by or by a large corporation who is extremely risk averse towards any kind of experimentation, then what kind of an impact investor would I be? I think that's really the kind of questions we are all grappling with. There is a lot that can be done by by the corporations, but not by actually pushing their CSR budgets. But probably, like Kevin mentioned about Starbucks and others, they need to really try to make themselves responsible in the way they are conducting their business. I think they all mouth the right words. The challenge is whether you can actually inculcate that as part of your habit. Some institutions do it well, some don't. So I think the challenge remains from that perspective. Whether impact investing is the right thing for large corporates is actually a question.
Vineet, there's also someone who says that she may be able to offer you $5 million, and if she does, what would you be why would you be so eager? But I think the question behind the essence behind what Partha was trying to ask is, what is it about an LP that appeals to you when raising money for your funds?
Well, there are three things. First, he should have money. So if a person has money, that appeals to me. The second is the person should actually ask me the right questions of what I'm trying to do. And third, should actually be as supportive when things go wrong with us. We have actually seen multiple times limited partners with capital actually are very jumpy. So there are a lot of people we have said no to from raising money, not because they are actually bad people. It's just that they are not really necessarily aware that the kind of risk we are going to carry, and there will be ups and downs. So really what you need from a limited partner is an ability to understand the challenge and be by your side when things go wrong, exactly like my entrepreneur expects me to be. So that's what, these are the three things.
Great. And just to wrap up, the last two questions. One is, do you think such a thing as conscious capitalism exists, and what are your thoughts on that? And then we'll go into closing comments. Kevin and Vineet, do you think a thing like conscious capitalism exists?
I'm not really sure of the term. I mean, it was popularized by the founder of Whole Foods, and it has a particular meaning. Lots of isms are stuck in the old mindset that created them, and I think capitalism right now is stuck in a neoliberal way of looking at things that only thinks about financial return and is allowed to put its externalities, its cost, onto the world, which is causing climate change. So I think we can use capital and we can use the market for our goods, but I avoid any ism that already has 500 years of history and say, we'll change that. And I think we have to change. We have to make capital a tool and not a force of nature in the way we think about it.
Vineet, your thoughts on conscious capitalism?
I really don't know much about it, but it all sounds similar to impact investing, etc. I think the nomenclatures, the name, I'm actually not a definition guy by nature itself. There is a lot of problems in the world. Let's actually act upon it. There is enough capitalism, and there are enough academicians who should be asked these questions. I'm probably not educated enough to answer it. So.
Great. And just to finally wrap up, Kevin and Vineet, what would you say are the two things you want to see change from impact investing 1.0 to impact investing 2.0? And just before you answer, we have a question for all our participants on, has impact investing done well given the nascency of the industry so far? Please do select, and if you have any specific comments on your answer, you can put it up here and we'll compile, put it up in the chat box and we'll compile it. But now to Vineet and Kevin on two things that you want to see change from impact investing 1.0 to impact investing 2.0.
I'll go first, and I'll actually give you my examples. The two things that I want to change about Avishkar and myself. In last a decade or more, all the investments we have made were basically not taking any risks to shift paradigms. We were basically taking execution risks and trying to support entrepreneurs do what people have been doing well with minor changes. Miniaturizing hospital to reduce capital asset lockout, create artisanal ownership, etc., etc. They sound great, but they were neither paradigm shifting nor were they new. We have not taken any risk that would actually change the status quo very significantly. So if one thing I want to change, I would like to actually invest in paradigm shifting innovations that can really bring about a monumental change just rather than an incremental change. Not saying incremental change is bad. This is actually a ask from myself. The second thing I think is I have actually personally been fascinated by being small, cute, and a bonsai. I would rather like to scale up and see ourselves scale up and become larger, able to attract larger capital, which requires us to actually rein our thoughts a little bit, probably be a little more dishonest than what we are. I think it goes to Kevin as well, because the world in general does not like too much of honesty. And I think the first point probably people will appreciate. The second change people will not appreciate in me. But these are the two changes that will allow us probably to become more successful.
Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, what would I want in Impact Investing 2.0? I think, it's like we're maybe where in the U.S. feminism was back in the 80s when people were going for dress for success and rather than creating independent personalities. So I think we don't need to think about going mainstream. I think we need to think about, as Vineet said, system changing kinds of things. But I think that also means changing the dominant metaphors in memes. I think we're stuck with an old metaphor, and so the more that we say we want to be like what capitalism is, that what the Goldman Sachs of the world are, we'll be going down the wrong path. The market solves some problems, and we should be realistic that the market doesn't solve all problems, but say where can entrepreneurs solve some problems and work on those. But I think it's limited. The market doesn't solve all problems, but the market does solve some problems. So I think realistically saying we only solve some problems would be great, and then fundamentally, trying to be non-extractive. I think we need to change the time signature around venture and sort of have some way that venture is patient enough to work on the timeline that impact also works on.
Great. On that note, I want to thank both you and Vineet for making the time to participate, and for all the participants who joined us today. Thank you so much for making the time. I hope the conversation was interesting to you all. We will share the recorded version soon, and very quickly just summing up the results of the poll. About 25% we've done well, and about 72% say we've done moderately. So I think on that positive note, I think impact investing has done fairly well, and there's a lot more for us to do and learn. And thank you so much, Kevin and Vineet, for joining us. And we look forward to hearing more at both SOCAP and Sankalp. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanika.
Yeah. Thank you, Kanika. Thank you, Vineet. This was fun.
Yeah, that was fun as well. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Great.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.